Hi, I'm Julie Fry. I'm President and CEO of California Humanities, and welcome to California Youth on the Ballot. What will 2040 look like? California Humanities is a 45-year-old independent nonprofit organization, and we are focused on connecting the people of California through the public humanities by making grants and delivering programs that we do across the state that help us to learn about our histories, cultures, experiences. In California on the Ballot, and this is the last in our current season of these, is a series of virtual events focused on issues of electoral engagement in California. And it's supported by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we're very grateful to them for making this happen. So I'm really happy to introduce Joaquin Alvarado. He is a founder of studiotobe, which is a fully integrated ecosystem for original reporting, storytelling, and community-based impact. Prior to studiotobe, he served as CEO of the Center for Investigative Reporting and held senior vice president roles in digital innovation and diversity at American Public Media and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Over to you, Joaquin.
Julie, many thanks. And it's really quite honored to be a part of this conversation today. Also want to just, again, thank the California Humanities for creating space and also continuing to engage our communities around these critical conversations. And the humanities are something that, of course, intersects so many different genres, art forms, constituents. It really is a unique resource. So very, very happy to be here. And we're going to dive into what I have a lot of suspicion is going to be a provocative, an interesting, and a pretty deep dive with some astounding, I'm not going to call you young leaders, I'm going to call you leaders in your various communities and also in the work that you do. And we want to take this time to kind of talk about not just the youth vote and engagement with our democratic systems, but also talk about what the stakes are. We live in one of the most dynamic places on planet Earth. This has been an extraordinary time to grow into being a member of the electorate. It's also been an incredible time to be a journalist, to be a storyteller, to be a poet, to be a filmmaker, to be a student. There have been so many different things happening in and around the critical issues that you all write about, report on, and create art from, that we really can afford this hour to take a step back and really get some perspective from you. So we can touch on a lot today, right? Obviously, we're confronted with enormous challenges around our environment, climate change, policing in America, racial justice in America, the future of our individual rights, our rights as community members, but also what is going to emerge in terms of the art space, and for the journalists and people who care about local journalism, what's going to emerge in terms of the sustainable future models for that. So you all can go any direction you want with these questions, but I just thank everyone for being in attendance and for you guys participating. Before we tee up actually the first question, we're actually going to share just a brief clip from Samuel and a piece that he did a couple of years back. And then we're going to dive in, and we're going to do this throughout. For each of the panelists, we're going to show some of the work that they're doing. Before we do that, though, we're going to have them introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with you, Danielle. If you take a minute, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Danielle. I live in Oakland. I'm born and raised. I am a teaching assistant at Youth Beat, which is a media arts program here in Oakland near Lake Merritt. And with Youth Beat and with a grant through California Humanities, we were able to produce a 15-minute documentary about gentrification in Oakland, which you'll get to see a little bit about today.
Excellent. And let me throw it over to you, JaNell.
Hi, I'm JaNell Gore. I'm a reporter with Kern News in Bakersfield, California, and I am graduating from Bakersfield College this semester.
Great. And how about Samuel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Samuel Getachew. I am an 18-year-old poet, writer, model. That's a newer thing. I'm currently living in Brooklyn, New York, but I was born and raised in Oakland, California. Served as the 2019 Oakland Youth Poet Laureate. I'm also currently a reporter with KQED Arts and Culture, and I am on a gap year before heading to Yale University this fall.
Excellent. Thanks for being with us, Samuel. So we got, we got Oakland, we got Bakersfield, we got Brooklyn. Maritza, introduce yourself and round us out. Where are you?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Maritza Camacho. I am a reporter and editor for the Oak Leaf News, Santa Rosa Junior College's news media here in Sonoma County. I actually brought to you by my newsroom right now. Yeah, I'm also a fellow for the California Humanities, Democracy, and the Informed Citizen. I'm a fellow for that as well. I'm also in my last year here at the Santa Rosa Junior College. I will be transferring to San Diego State for fall 2021.
Excellent. And just through the many lives that I get to live, I've had a chance to actually collaborate on some level with three of you. And I've known Samuel's work just being an Oaklander. Very excited to have you in this conversation. I actually want to start with a clip from a piece that you did, Samuel, a couple of years back. Then we're going to dive into a question that really want to explore where this intersection around critical issues in the community, what it means to actually be in a democratic system where we should be able to have impact on those, right? To kind of reflect the direction that the country should be moving in or could be moving in, but also the role of art in that space. So before we go there, let's roll the clip.
I find it fascinating how the right to bear arms comes second only to free speech, but is 11 amendments above outlawing slavery. I wonder when we got our priorities so out of order. And as I sat at home on the 4th of July and listened to the sound of fireworks go on for hours, I wondered to myself, when did America fall so in love with the sound of gunshots that she wanted to hear them on her birthday?
Samuel, I'm going to start with you. There's very few issues as polarizing, obviously, as gun control. But you did this piece as a high school student, if I'm correct. Talk a little bit about what bringing sort of that perspective to your art has been like, and what do you feel the roles, responsibilities of artists and creators are to talk about the issues that you feel are important for us as a society to negotiate?
So I wrote that poem when I was, I think, 14 years old. I'm 18 now, closer to 19 than I am to 18, which is weird to think about because it feels like I blinked and all of a sudden I wasn't 12 anymore. But I feel about that poem the way that I think you would expect someone to feel about art that they created when they were 14. But I do understand why other people are still feel that it resonates with them. And I do understand why I did at the time. It's just hearing your voice when you're 14 is very jarring.
That'll keep happening to you, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll look at the things that I wrote at this age in 3 years and be mortified. But I think, for me, I don't even really consider myself an activist. And this is something that I talk about a lot on panels like this, just because I think that it's for a lot of reasons, but the main one being that I think we've played out the term activist to the point where it doesn't really mean anything concrete anymore. And I'm much more comfortable and feel much more concrete in the title or the label of artist, because I think that that's something tangible. I think I produce art, I produce my writing. And I think that for me, the most valuable way to show up as a member of my community, as a global citizen, as a Black person, the biggest ways that I can show up for the people in the communities that I love is through my art. And I think that even if I were to take on, this personal label or personal responsibility of a quote unquote activist, I think that the most useful thing I would be able to do in that role, and I think that the biggest thing that I can bring to the table is my writing. And so all of my writing, I think, in some way, whether explicitly or implicitly, is political because of that, because I think my existence is political and because I'm constantly concerned about political things. Tony K. Bambara, there's a quote that I go back to all the time. The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I think that, all art has a political message, and if it's claiming not to, it's because it supports the status quo. And so I think I've never really been able to afford to create art that supports the status quo. So that's kind of always where my art has gone.
Well, that tension exists in other genres, right? And I mean, to go back to sort of the founding document, right, which you quote in the piece, the freedom of the press is embedded in the First Amendment. But these are very, very intense issues in our communities, right, that are at the top of every news feed. JaNell, I want to just call on you here for a moment, right? I mean, Bakersfield is a community, if you haven't visited there, it's extraordinarily diverse. There's a lot happening. You've both reported, I believe, coming out of the community college newsroom, but also for South Kern Soul. Talk a little bit about your work relative to your proximity to some of the issues that maybe you're covering as a journalist.
Yeah, so with mine, I go back and forth a lot with the theme of journalism and art, and all on thankfully Kern Soul lets me do both on the website. And it's really just finding the first thing that I see and saying, this has resonated with me. I have to talk about it. Someone needs to hear this story. And following through with that, I've been with Kern Soul News since I was 17, my senior year in high school, because I was working on the VHS newspaper and met someone who introduced me to Kern Soul. And since then, it's just been, I feel my duty to talk about the issues that impact Bakersfield, because like you said, it's very diverse. And so no matter where you go in Bakersfield, there's an issue, but it could be completely different than the issue on this side of town. And recently I realized that when I moved to the other side of town, I'm like, whoa, okay, now I have to talk about this and that, you know? It's really interesting to look at it that way.
So Maritza, I'll go to you also. I mean, you are actually in a newsroom right now, and as you're coming up in journalism, how are you negotiating this? How do you work with other reporters that you collaborate with? And I'll bring up one for the Latino community. Immigration is never that far out of mind or place, right? Many of our communities have incredible diversity in terms of immigrant populations. I think 1 in 4 Californians were immigrants at some point in their lives. So we it's not like you can ignore this stuff, but how do you negotiate that as a journalist?
I think there's a misconception that there isn't art in journalism, and I do believe that there is an art in journalism because at the end of the day, we're all storytellers. It's funny how you mentioned immigration. I was working on this feature story of day laborers here in Sonoma County. And the issues they face, especially working through COVID and working during the wildfires, and the rights that they have. And it's just at the end of the day, because a lot of them are undocumented, they can't use their voice as easily as a lot of we can. So as a journalist, like we are really giving a voice to the voiceless. I know we hear that a lot. It's a cliche at the end of the day, but it's something that's really important. And like I said, as storytellers, we try to captivate our audience in many ways. Like Samuel, like you mentioned your poems, and JaNell as well. You're both really into poetry, so it's basically different ways to captivate different people's stories in different forms of art, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and this idea of accountability, right? Samuel, you said your existence is political, right? The job of journalism is to hold the powerful accountable, right? To interrogate systems of power and injustice. That's what you're taught to learn. Danielle, you've been on all sides of this, though. Even in this early season of your career, you've been a student, you've been a teacher, you've been a producer. How do you manage this? Because you kind of exist at a lot of these different intersections.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely various aspects to my career and the stories that I try to tell, but really like since the very beginning, when I first decided to pursue film, I was like, kind of like Maritza said, it's kind of corny or like, give a voice to people who don't have a voice. It's, my mom sat me down and we had the whole conversation, but it really is true. And it's something that I've like brought with me for my entire career, because at the end of the day, like, I want my work, I want the stories that I tell to really say something and really sway opinions, sway people's mindsets, and not and to, yeah, I want to really like persuade people. And it's also, we kind of have to persuade people into like believing in human rights and not killing innocent people. I would like for that to not happen, you know what I mean? And I mean, that's why a lot of us are creating art. Whether it's writing, poetry, journalism, documentary, like, yeah, it's all very necessary.
Samuel, I want to just come back to you before we move on from this question. I mean, hearing all of these perspectives, it has to land somewhere. Somebody has to hear it, listen to it, read it, right? Sit with this work, right? And what do you think the critical question is for audiences, right? Because they're not all going to be youth audiences. They're going to be intergenerational. They'll be multiracial. They could be all over the world in this day and age. How do you maintain enough relationship to who is the audience so that you have a sense of that feedback loop as to whether or not you're having an impact?
I actually really try not to create with an audience in mind when I'm writing poetry. I've started to do journalism in the last year more. I already had kind of done a little bit of it, mostly opinion writing, but I've started to do more journalism, both opinion writing and reporting this year, partially because COVID made in-person poetry performing like not really a thing. And so I just kind of pivoted to that. And I've noticed that, when you're writing an article and you're reporting about something, I do very much like down to which outlet I try to place it with, down to who I interview and why, like think about the audience. But when I'm creating art, and I think for the sake of answering this question, I'm going to like separate journalism and art, but I do agree with one of the points made previously about how their journalism is a kind of art. But I think when I that is the main difference for me between when I'm creating poetry or creative nonfiction versus journalism. And I think it's because I notice that when I start trying to cater to an audience with poetry, I begin kind of undercutting my own artistic instinct, which is what I think brings the poetry value in the first place. And so I write poetry with the intention only of telling what I believe is true. And as if I can be as honest as possible, I think then that's all I really hope to do within a poem. But the way that I gauge with my art, the impact that it has, and time again, this has like blown my mind, like people from places that I would have never expected, demographics that I would have never expected, having seen or read my work. I've gotten some pretty angry messages from complete strangers. I've gotten emails, I've gotten DMs, comments. That poem that you shared at the beginning, the clip from it, probably my most quote unquote viral piece to date. And it was my first time getting that kind of attention for it, but it kind of went viral on Twitter, and all of a sudden I was getting tagged by dozens and dozens of like Make America Great Again accounts, and it was like ended up on the wrong side of Twitter. And I've seen, the kind of vitriol that can come from that, and from a demographic that I definitely wasn't thinking about seeing the poem when I wrote it. But that, at the end of the day, was actually how I gauged that the poem was effective. Because if something has unseated your view of the world so deeply, and you are so disturbed by that you are now calling, at the time, a 14-year-old slurs on the internet, that means that I challenged something you believed about the world, and you didn't like that.
I think
and as much as that was scary for me at the time, I think afterwards I realized that at the end of the day, whether the positive feedback doesn't necessarily mean that I created a change. If I'm preaching to the choir, I don't think that actually does very much. But I think that there was an entire demographic of people enabled through the internet, like you mentioned earlier, that would have never heard that perspective. Sorry, that's the noise of Brooklyn. I don't know.
All good.
It's loud. But there was an entire demographic of people that I wouldn't have normally accessed, who wouldn't have sought my work out, certainly, who all of a sudden had their view about the world challenged so deeply that they reacted in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful perspective, Samuel. And again, that was originally what the design of a free press was meant to do, right? Was to challenge the worldview or the assumptions, right? And do that also in terms of free expression in the arts. And there's a proud tradition of that. One of the things that we're confronting for Californians is the sense of what place means, right? And with an enormous eruption of unhoused communities trying to navigate not just skyrocketing housing, but a stack of issues, right, that make housing so complex in our communities, including income inequality. Danielle, you made a film, or you guys produced a film on this. I want to show a clip from that before we go into the conversation around these issues, but just to set a frame. You come in with your concerns, your passions, the things you feel like you need to go after, right? Every great reporter, every great artist has the things that they go after. And there's no way to escape this question around housing as one of the key issues that my generation, frankly, has failed at. I grew up in Oakland, and when I see what's happened with people's ability to live, it's really, really demoralizing. So we transfer a lot of hope to you all. But Danielle, tee up this clip really quickly for us. Just let us know what we're going to see, and then let's roll the clip. But go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah, so this documentary is basically a youth perspective of gentrification in Oakland, and basically asking the questions of how did we get here? And then also, what does that mean for youth who are just about to leave school and trying to see where they're going to go?
The first time I heard the word gentrification, I was 13 years old.
I think it's like two sides of community, the structure of the community and the people in the community.
It's like an apocalypse almost.
As a young kid, you shouldn't be exposed to certain things that you are in Oakland.
Getting really expensive. A lot of my neighbors actually have moved out of my neighborhood.
A lot of my friends or people I've known since I was really little are getting like pushed out.
There have been buildings that have been taken down, and a lot of big, nice, flashy buildings have been coming in lately.
It's like you've been living here for so long and you don't really want to leave.
I don't think I want to pay that much to live here.
Change is inevitable, right? Everything's always going to change. People are going to move in and out. But the negative changes have been families leaving.
So what happened when that film came out, Danielle? How did people react?
I think that the reaction from the community was mostly positive. We had a premiere event and lots of folks from the community came out, and it was really well received from schools, actually, which was nice. I got to show the film to various classrooms and groups of students and engage with them about like, what did they learn and their thoughts. So that was really probably the best part, I think, was engaging with students.
Did you feel like you were advancing the conversation in the community? Do you see daylight on this issue and that more reporting is helping?
I mean, I would hope so. The thing is, our premiere event was in January of 2020 or like February of 2020. And then March, we had like multiple things happening, and then the pandemic happened. And of course, we couldn't have any more events. But I think that what we did was we showed a new perspective, because we've got like the city's perspective and what their vision for Oakland is and what the mayor and all of those folks are doing and all that stuff. But like, what about the kids? What about the families? What about, these folks who are graduating college and they want to stay with their families, but their families can't afford to live here anymore and they need to be near school? Like, there's so many different things and so many different people that folks have been leaving out of the conversation that are actually the most impacted.
Yeah, JaNell, I want to go to you. You work with South Kern Soul, one of the great media organizations in the state of California. And if folks don't know it who are hearing this, you should definitely check it out and get with it. But talk a little bit about, it's not exactly the same issue with gentrification, of course, in Bakersfield, but what are the issues that you guys try to have some ownership around staying with? And in your own work, where does that intersect in terms of what you choose to cover?
Yeah, so like I said, Bakersfield has a lot of issues depending on the side of town you're on, so we have things from the way our education is, from housing, which is a lot of what a few girls have now taken. So the way it is sometimes we will have a few girls that are to this and a few people to this. So we have housing, education, racism, and so we're looking at it. It's hard to say what we'll stick with because we're trying to cover every single thing in Kern County. And Kern County, like I said, is very diverse. In some parts, your biggest problem might be immigration. But in the other side of town where I was living at first, it was homelessness. And so I really just try to stick with whatever story speaks out to me at that time. Like right now, I think that's bothering me is recently some people from RDA took a hood tour on one side of town because someone was, and they were from the gang unit, and they took a hood tour on that side of town, basically making a mockery of these sides of town. So that's going to be the next thing that I want to speak on. That's why, so it's really hard to say that what we'll stick with, because living in a place as big as Bakersfield, as big as Kern County, we have way too many issues to count, which is sad, but we're doing our best to tackle every single one of them and make as much change as we can.
Yeah, Maritza, just would love your reaction to that. You also mentioned something that, again, has become a fact of life in California, which is the impact of fire on communities. And is it felt proportionately, or how do communities recover, from the aftermath? But from your vantage point, how close to some of these issues in your coverage and the coverage of the newsroom are you in Santa Rosa? And then you guys come from families that all live in and around. I'm assuming, most people don't commute more than an hour, maybe, give or take. Give us a little sense of where you guys choose to focus and if you're seeing an impact from your coverage.
I think definitely with the wildfires, it's now become an annual thing. So like, you like it or not, like you're gonna either be having to evacuate, having to pack all your things before. It's a quote unquote new normal for us. So the coverage that we do, we are giving the constant updates to the people. We have reporters going out, taking pictures like the night of the fires. And it's something really important to us. Personally, I have had to evacuate 3 or 4 times because of the fires since the Tubbs fires. The Tubbs fires, that was 2017. It came just a few blocks from my house. So I saw the fire glowing like in a field in front of my house. And it's just it's a mental kind of thing that you have to go through. It's like, is this the last time I'm going to see my house? Each time you have to go evacuate. And going to what Danielle was saying about housing, I've, with the podcast we're working on right now with the California Humanities Fellowship, we've had to talk to people with different stories. A former classmate of mine, she has a family of 7, and when they lost their home, they had to be in a small 2-bedroom apartment, try fitting 7 people with 5 children, 2 parents, and a 2-bedroom apartment. It's hard for these people to trying to adapt to it. So it's important to us to get this news out there, because not many people realize the stories that these families have to go through, having to evacuate, having issues with house insurance, having just different issues that come up with the wildfires, and just trying to navigate it all at the end of the day.
I got to double click on that then. I mean, so you're experiencing it, then you're trying to cover it at the same time. What's the self-care? How do you create your own sort of safe space to, compartmentalize? I don't want to use that term, but to also get all this other, and you're also a student at Santa Rosa Community College, right? So how do you negotiate all those different pressures?
It's definitely hard. I have to tell you that, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to put out this word, get the people, notified about what's happening around us, in a daily basis, with updates and everything like that. Then there's also me worrying about my family and myself of I get anxiety just smelling smoke. So it's just trying to navigate that as well. But also we're now used to how people have snow days, we have bad air days. So having to get off school because of that, It definitely is not easy to get used to at first, but I think I've realized to put other people before me and taking care of them, having them notified of what's happening, definitely has, I guess, helped out and how to live each fall with the fire seasons.
Samuel, I'd love to get your take on this too, and let me just add one orbit to the question. Which is there are so many major issues, and they all seem to be at maximum, pressure right now, right? And we're surrounded by these. And for many, just getting through the last election cycle was super intense, right? So as an artist and somebody who also does journalism, how do you see around the corner? How do you see past the seemingly intractable issues that we're confronted with, or do you? And also, how do you manage the pressure? Right? You mentioned you got all this blowback on Twitter, but this never-ending state, right, of having to have things out in the world and not necessarily having all the control in terms of how people are coming to that content. What's your approach?
In terms of seeing around the corner, I like that you added "if you do," because I was going to say I kind of don't. I am notoriously pessimistic and also perpetually stressed. But don't learn from me. I think when I am the most okay about it, and I think the best coping mechanism that I've found, and I think, and this might not work for some people. I do see why for some people it wouldn't. But something that I was thinking about recently, and I had a couple conversations with people whose opinions I really respected, who kind of confirmed what I was thinking about. My generation has grown up with just constant access to knowledge and to information. And in some ways that's really, really cool. And it definitely has shaped who I am as a person. I mean, I started learning feminist vocabulary on Instagram when I was 13, so I'm grateful in a lot of ways for what that access to information has done for me. And I think that we take a lot of the positives of social media for granted when we complain about it. But at the same time, that constant barrage of information means that we're also able to, for pretty much the first time in human history, constantly know about every crisis that is going on all over the world all at once. And 50 years ago, we were pretty globalized, but not to this degree. Think about 500 years ago. If you think about back when the British were governing America, despite the fact that it took 6 months to get a message overseas, humans are not designed like mentally and neurologically to be able to process anything more than really their immediate environment. And for the vast majority, 99% of human history, we didn't, because we didn't know. All of Rome could be burning and we wouldn't have known. The entire world could be on fire, and if your village or your community or what was directly in front of you was okay, that's what you knew. And if it wasn't okay, the only problem that you had to deal with was the one in front of your face. And now this constant barrage of information also comes with a constant barrage of knowledge about everyone's suffering. And so naturally our reaction is to think to ourselves, the world has never been this bad before. Things have never been this bad before. They very well could have been. That wouldn't have been our problem. And so when I look at it that way, it is a little bit morbid, because you're thinking, on one hand, you're like, it's always been like this. But I think it helps me feel a little bit less like this is like the end of days, and like no time has ever had this much human suffering. It's not that. It's that we now know about it. And that knowledge can be really great because it means that we can address a lot of these problems, but it also is extremely overwhelming. And so looking at it that way, I think, has helped me over time kind of just wash some of that existential dread away. And the same really goes for like online vitriol. Like, if it wasn't for the internet, you wouldn't know who I am. You have no immediate impact on my material life. So I at the end of the day, if you hate me, what does that really do? I think that looking at it that way has helped. Just thinking of myself as a pilgrim in the 1600s is basically what I'm saying. Helps me.
Sorry,
Joaquin,
Joaquin.
we can't hear you.
I was just testing you guys, make sure everyone's paying attention. So there was a sense that those pilgrims had, that many had, not all, of course, coming to the Western Hemisphere, certainly not if you were indigenous, maybe you had a different view of what the pilgrims were doing, but that the arc of history was pointed towards justice, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, right? And in that sense, and Dr. King's view of it also was voting rights, right? Were going to be the mechanism. That was the essential tool that, as it expanded to like be equally available to all Americans, things would get better, that it would work out, right? That you could negotiate even in the most intense times towards a future with more justice, not less, right? And this is where I will say, as a 48-year-old, I was born to civil rights and education activists. We felt that, even though we didn't have a ton of resources, we felt it was going in the right direction. But now we see an era where voting rights are contracting in some places, in some communities, for some racial and ethnic groups. They're actually potentially going dramatically in reverse. And so I want to kind of get into a conversation around our theme of young voters, right? There's a lot at stake right now, right? And it's not a partisan issue. This is a really important one, right? It's a democratic systems issue as to whether or not we're fulfilling the mandate of the Constitution or not, right? So JaNell, you actually got into this, and we're going to invite you, if you're good with that, to kind of read for us, share with us directly some of the work you've done on this issue, and then I'm going to pass the ball around, because I think this is almost the fulcrum of this conversation, right? It's whether or not we have a way to, again, maintain that arc towards justice, or we have to think about our country as a different kind of place. So JaNell, please.
Yeah, so the story you're talking about, I believe, is the one where I talked about how important it is for us to take control of our vote, because for so many years, we didn't have that right. You know, we had to fight first being Black, then being a Black woman. You know, we just didn't get it. And so now it's time for us and young people to take control of it, because we really do control what happens sometimes. And I hear a lot of people say, you know, why vote? What are they going to do for me? Nothing if you don't vote, because they don't think you're paying attention. And so I think that's the way to really take over, is to vote people who actually care about us into office. You know, we got a Black woman in there right now. If that don't show you what we can do, nothing does. And so it's really just taking control of it. And I think you guys wanted me to read the first paragraph of my story.
We'd love to hear your voice with it, yes.
Okay. So, let me pull up on my phone because my eyesight is.
Take your time, yes.
Okay, one moment. Here it is. All right. Voting has always been and still is a very important right, a right that some groups have fought for decades. It allows citizens to have a voice in policies being passed and in who makes decisions. This is why our ancestors fought so hard to make sure we have had the right. And I, for this story, talked to my Black history professor at Bakersfield College, who told me, you know, the next quote, he said, "What I mean by power is it can be defined by the ability to influence under other individuals to do something you want them to do." And I love that quote, because it's exactly what voting is making sure that policies that will affect us directly happen and will take care of us in the long run.
Danielle, I'd love your reaction to this too. And you teach young people, right? You are producing content with them. You're kind of bringing them up right behind you, right? What's their relationship to this question of voting? Is that on people's minds right now?
Absolutely, yeah. I remember election day, basically election week, we had a lot of conversations about voting, and, you know, a lot of our students are like ready. They're like 17, about to get registered. A lot of our 18-year-old students were like ready to vote. And I'm sure there are some that are like still disinterested in politics. They don't want to vote. They don't think that it has an impact. So I've definitely seen a lot of that too. And it's an ongoing discussion for sure, because I think yeah, like the idea that our votes don't have any impact is a very commonplace thought process. And I don't think that that's entirely true, because then there's also the opposite of our votes do have an impact, but that's not necessarily the end all be all. Like,
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
And just to double click on that for 1 second, in Oakland, on an issue like housing, do you feel like young voters are actually influencing how politicians are thinking or are responding to the issue?
I would hope that would be the case today. I would hope that tides are starting to turn a bit as politicians get older and are voted out and new politicians are coming into power. I would hope that, the young folks right now that are 18, 19, 20 are starting to have their voices heard, yeah.
Maritza, the two-part question to you related to this. Do you guys cover local elections from the newsroom?
Yes, we actually endorsed different local people during our election season.
Great. And you mentioned you cover the undocumented community. There's 183,000, I think is the number, DACA students in California who are standing on the sidelines while these elections are happening. Any sense of strategies, and it's not just Latinos, obviously, who can be in this country undocumented. There's enormous populations from all over the world in California, but how do you take that into account when you do cover local elections? Not everybody gets to vote in these elections, even though they may have a real direct impact on their lives.
I think it's definitely very important. I think for me personally, I come from, my parents are both immigrants. Actually, when I first voted, was their first time voting as well. So it was a very celebratory time for all of us. But that's when I realized how important my vote was, because I saw the issues that were really important to immigrants and how they can be activists about it, but they can't really use their vote like other people have that privilege of doing. So I guess for me, definitely when students are trying to see, they're talking about voting, maybe some of them don't want to vote, because I remember like during the 2020 elections, they're like, I don't like any of them, I'll just like not vote. And I'm just like, you have this privilege that not many other people can. And just talking to other undocumented people, DACA students that I know personally, who they want to see a change in the system, but as much as they talk about it, like there's people around that don't want to use their voice that they have the privilege of having, because a vote is so important. It's changing the system that is really messed up right now.
So you actually did some coverage, I think, on California Prop 16 around reinstating affirmative action. I think we have a visual we might be able to go to. Can you talk us through this coverage a little bit? And then we have a great question in the Q&A. I'm going to read it out loud and ask you all to respond to it. But tell us about this coverage.
Yeah, so Prop 16, I actually came up across the proposition because I was enrolled in a bunch of texts that you get like vote yes or vote no on this proposition. Prop 16 is reinstating affirmative action. For those who don't know what affirmative action is, during 1996, there was a Proposition 209 that banned a race-based or sex-based preference in hiring in like college admissions, and Prop 16 was lifting that ban. For me, that was important because I was applying to CSUs, UCs, and just being able to see the enrollment and making it more diverse and open for people of color like myself. I am a first generation Latina student. And it's, what I saw was that the UCs and the CSUs have a enrollment at a glance, showing how the diversity of student population. But as I did more research, I realized that what the enrollment at a glance shows the UCs and the CSUs as a whole, and not the more prestigious UCs and CSUs. So say like they might have more enrollment in like UC Riverside or a UC Merced,
which is the quote unquote less prestigious, versus UCLA or UC Berkeley, which if you see the admissions, those are predominantly white people. And it's just seeing that and how we are still, the minority population, student population is still very underrepresented. And if we had brought back affirmative action, we could have increased the amount of minority students that would be enrolled in these colleges. Unfortunately, the proposition did not pass. So we are still in this lingo of, is the minority population going to be represented enough in these coming new numbers of the fall enrollment? And I guess when I talk to more people about this proposition, people against it, people for it, I came across a couple of very fascinating, interesting points of views, especially people against affirmative action, saying that a certain person did not want, they thought that we would be discriminating against white males and that white males shouldn't be discriminated against. And that it brought a kind of, I guess, fire in me, because they've had it easy for so long and us, the minority, have not. So it's definitely something that became really important for me to bring out, because I guess, especially for the young vote, the young voters don't have they don't do as much research on the propositions as we should be doing, because I guess these propositions are what really make a change. It's not the, I guess, feel like the media puts a lot of the importance on the big officials, the presidents and all that stuff, but what makes the real change is these propositions.
Well, the argument for local journalism is that the school board, right, board of supervisors, city council, police commissions, right, this is where you actually live your life, right, on the street, in the community, and there's a lot of power there. That really, with the decline in local journalism, there's less and less of that basic day-to-day coverage. Also, I'll just remark for those in the audience and myself, my son was born in '96, right? So to think about a generation coming into their leadership time, right? And that's what you guys are doing right now, that was born after what was such a polarizing proposition in California state history, is really somewhat remarkable. We've got a question I want to put to everyone here. And there's a word here that's going to be the reason why I give it to you first, Samuel. But what long-term political consequences will the increased representation for youth and BIPOC have on society? Are you optimistic? There's our word, Samuel. Will equal representation result in the equality we've been fighting for so long? And thank you to Trenton for that question. Samuel, take a shot at that.
Ever the pessimist. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to rain on everyone's parade. I've definitely transitioned in my thinking about this over the course of the past year. And I think I think about things very differently now than I did at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of last summer, at the end of last summer. I'm going to talk about a couple things. I'm no longer interested in securing seats at the table for people of color if the structure of that table is oppressive. And I think that, you know, I really try not to rain on the parade of people being grateful that we have the representation of a Black woman in the White House. I am very understanding of the fact that of what that means to a lot of people, and I don't want to undervalue that, but to me, that doesn't really mean very much. And the reason for that is that I'm not really interested in working my way up the ranks of a white supremacist institution. I used to want to be president of the United States. For the first 15 years of my life, I genuinely believed that was going to be my life. I wanted to be a politician. And the reason for that was partially that I was interested in politics, and partially because American adults aren't very inventive with the compliments that they give children, and they tell every single child that they think is intelligent that they need to be president. And so I'd heard that my whole life. And so I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And I had a very rude awakening when I realized that that wasn't actually at all what I wanted to do. And that changed for me because I realized that, you know, that wouldn't actually create any change. And I am at a point now where, and I think we societally and culturally have arrived at a point where it is incredibly, incredibly lucrative to pretend to care about Black people for face. And we've also arrived at a point where it's incredibly, incredibly lucrative to appear diverse. And you know, on one hand, that is a good thing. I think it has led to a lot of opportunity for people, including myself, to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. But none of that change is actually happening behind the scenes. I worked with, I did a brand campaign, my very first time modeling for American Eagle at the end of 2019. And, you know, this is not to disparage the brand or the people that I worked with, because I did work with some incredibly lovely people behind the scenes. The cast of this campaign, about half of us were Black. Behind the scenes, cameramen, PAs, directors, creative directors, stylists, makeup artists, there were maybe 1 or 2 Black people on a team that encompassed almost 50 people, including the corporate side. Throughout my entire time, I was partnered with the brand, doing a lot of front-facing stuff, where me and a group of 9, I think about 4 or 5 of us out of the 9 were Black, on an outward-facing end for American Eagle for about 2 years. In that entire time, I encountered 1 high-up corporate employee that was Black. All of the rest were white. And something that happened a couple of weeks ago, I submitted to a casting actually to act in a role for a Brooklyn indie film about Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter protests. And I was sent more information. I was sent the script to audition, and I was sent the bios and the photos of the crew members, the director, the screenwriter, everybody that would be working behind the scenes. Every single person was white, and I now have declined to audition. I think that there is no use in painting the outside of all of these institutions as diverse if behind the scenes everything still looks like this. There's no use in having a Black woman in the White House if, you know, all of these institutions that continue to oppress working class Black women continue to do what they've always done. And so, you know, that's my kind of pessimistic.
Well, but it's a critical lens, right? Which again, the role of the arts, the role of journalists is to apply that critical lens. I want to turn the lens around though, Danielle, you're a filmmaker. What's your take on this issue? Because I will point out a couple of things, right? Again, even if it's moving slowly, what faith do you have that the more diverse the country gets, right? If there's actually, you know, expansive, not contracting voting rights and access, optimistic? How do you feel? What's the next 15 to 20 years?
Shoot. I mean, I agree with everything Samuel said. Like, I don't want to sit at the table with white men if the table is still going to be like the same oppressive, ugly table, you know? Like, let's dismantle the whole table, make a whole new table. So I'm with you, Samuel, in that regard. I mean, I do think that more young people voting does make a tangible change, like how we saw in Georgia, and so many young and Black folks got out and voted and actually made a tangible change. So that's like one step in the right direction. And I think that there's likely going to be a lot of pushback as well from the opposite side within the next 5 years, just as a reaction to the change that we're able to make. So I think that there's going to be a consistent, you know, steps forward, pushback, steps forward, pushback. But yeah, I don't think that it stops at equal representation. I don't think it stops at Black kids vote now. I think that's maybe where we start, but like that's not the end all be all, I don't think.
So it's potentially a part of a larger strategy to restructure systems that you might feel are inherently unjust.
Dismantle and restructure, yes.
Let's round the corner here on this though, if we can, JaNell. Like take that one step further. You are a journalist, you're an artist. how do journalists cover this issue? Because Stacey Abrams and what happened in Georgia is a really critical example, right? Where, again, a big impact on the last election, of course. JaNell, what's your lens as a journalist and a poet?
Yeah, I just want to say it's funny because of how he was saying he wanted to be president. And when I first got into politics, it was because I joined the Young Democrats Club in my high school on accident. And then after the high school, my teacher, he kept pressing, like, JaNell, you should get into politics. And I was like, no, that's not the place for me. But I stuck with journalism and art because I feel like I'm doing more work here than I would be like had I been in the offices of right now, because like they said, it's still built for to exclude us and push out white people. And so I was about to say the exact same thing as Danielle, and it needs to be completely taken apart. And I think that that's the reason why I stick with journalism and art, because I can show the reasons why without getting the backlash that maybe a politician would get for saying it. If they think that that's what's going to happen to them, it's not going to affect me the same. I have to go out there and with my journalism and my art and show which stories, depending on what type of stories, which way I'm going to go for journalism and art. But with my journalism, it helps me to hold more people accountable to do that change if they are going to get into office. If you're going to get into office and say you're going to represent us, okay, well then I like recently, one of our journalists did a story on what they think Biden needed to prioritize in his first 90 or 100 days. That's what I think is important for us to do here as journalists, is say, okay, you're here, this is what you need to do. This is what the people on the streets want you doing.
Yes, and we're just about at time, guys. Maritza, I'm going to do something that's not totally fair, but KQED Education Production just put a huge issue in here. This is almost like a part 2. We need to have like an unplugged session or something. But just curious how this generation feels about the long-term effects of the mental health crisis that so many of their peers are experiencing, and what support they need to make sure that all of this potential and energy is not lost or deterred. So let's say we're your newsroom, you're the editor, Maritza. What direction do you point us in to answer that question?
I think right now, mental health is a really big issue. I think especially in my community, when last fall we had to go through a series of wildfires, we had to go through a really excruciating election. We had to go through still being in a pandemic and just bad air days. And it's when you pile that on top, of course, all our mental health is just going to be bad. In simplest terms, bad. But in trying to navigate that, and I know that a lot of my peers feel that, it's just trying to expose the mental health outlets and resources that there are out there. I know that my newsroom, we tend to put out coverage of what my college is doing. In say Wednesdays, there's I think it's Wednesdays is the mental health chat with other school therapists and school counselors. That's how our newsroom is trying to expose the help that there is around here, because I know that a lot of us are struggling, and we're trying to see if there is a light in any chance. But I know that I also work with kids as my job, and I see how a lot of these kids, their mental health is as worse as us because they're growing up with these things. And just having to be able to talk to them and being there for them is super important. And as a journalist, I also talked about that in one of my articles about the importance of helping out these students and these children, because it's something that is super important. There are future presidents, future senators, future doctors, future lawyers. It's our future, and something that is definitely difficult to work with.
Well, I want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation and sharing openly, and again, applying that critical lens. Also for the work that you're doing right now and will do. There's only qualified confidence that everything's going to work out if we don't do something about it, right? Whatever form that takes. And it'll be extraordinary to follow what you guys turn around and do, you know, as you're in your youth stage. I don't know how long that lasts. We didn't get to ask that question. And I will just also thank the California Humanities. Bringing us all together for these kinds of dialogues is the role of the humanities. So to Julie and Renee and Kirsten, all of them, thank you very much. And just before we leave, please stay connected to the California Humanities, follow the work of these journalists and artists, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.